Right now, you are listening to this with the feeling that you chose to press play. Maybe you were scrolling, saw the title, got curious and thought, yeah, I'll listen to this for a bit. It feels simple, you decided, you clicked, and here you are, end of story. But what if that decision was already shaped long before you were aware of it? Tonight, we're going to take a slow walk through one of the oldest questions humans have asked. Do we really have free will, or are we just watching a movie that was written for us in advance? Let's start from something familiar. Think about a small choice you made today. Maybe it was whether to make coffee or tea. Maybe you decided what time to leave the house, or whether to answer a message right away or ignore it for a while. All of these tiny choices feel like they rose freely from inside your mind. I wanted it, so I did it, you might say. But now, step back from that scene and look at it from a little distance. In that moment, how many things were influencing you? Your level of sleep, your stress, your childhood habits, your culture, your family, your personality, even a video you watched 5 minutes earlier. The choice still felt like yours, but it might have been the result of a long chain of causes. This is where the idea of determinism comes in. In simple terms, determinism says this: if you know the exact state of the universe at one moment and the laws of physics never change, then every moment that follows is, in some sense, fixed. If we could rewind the universe all the way back to the beginning and press play again, with the same initial conditions, the same stars would form, the same planets would appear, the same people would be born, and right now you would be listening to this exact sentence again. It's a harsh picture. In this view, the moment when you say, I chose this, might just be the last link in a very long chain of causes and effects. So does this mean free will is completely an illusion? Before we jump to that conclusion, let's slow down and walk into the brain for a moment. Scientists who study the mind have tried to look directly at the instant when people make decisions. One of the most famous sets of experiments is associated with a researcher named Benjamin Libet. In these experiments, participants were asked to do something very simple. At a moment of their own choosing, they would flex a finger or move their wrist. At the same time, they watched a special clock and reported the point at which they first became aware of the intention to move. The surprising result was this: in the brain, a readiness signal appeared a fraction of a second before the person reported, "This is the moment I decided." In other words, the brain seemed to start preparing the action before the conscious mind noticed the intention. This has often been turned into dramatic headlines: your brain decides before you do. Free will is an illusion. It sounds like the conscious you is just a commentator, arriving late to a decision that has already been made. But the story is not that simple. First, the actions in these experiments are tiny and trivial, flicking a finger at an arbitrary moment. Big, meaningful decisions, moving to another city, ending or starting a relationship, changing careers, are far more complex and unfold over much longer times. Second, many philosophers and neuroscientists argue that these readiness signals do not necessarily show that consciousness is fake or irrelevant. Instead, they might show that decision-making is a process that begins unconsciously and then becomes conscious. The fact that a process starts below awareness does not automatically mean that awareness plays no role in shaping or endorsing the final action. There is something else we need to recognize here. We are not the all-seeing director of everything that happens in our mind. We are more like someone watching the stage from the front row, seeing some of the actors and some of the lines, but not the entire backstage machinery. The brain is constantly processing information, forming tendencies, and preparing actions in the background. Conscious awareness seems to light up only the last part of that process and then says, I decided. This doesn't prove that free will does not exist, but it does suggest that choosing is not as simple as it feels from the inside. Now let's shift from the brain to philosophy. When people say free will, they usually mean something like this: at the moment of decision, I truly could have done otherwise. You could have chosen a different job. You could have walked away instead of arguing. You could have skipped this video and watched something else. But if determinism is true, if every event is the result of prior causes, then it seems as though you could not actually have done otherwise. Under the exact same conditions, you would have made the same choice again. For some philosophers, this conclusion destroys free will. These thinkers are called hard determinists. They say that in a fully determined universe, there is no room for genuine freedom. On the other side, there are philosophers who insist that real free will requires more than just a complicated brain process. They argue for something called libertarian free will, not political libertarianism, but a philosophical position. According to this view, at the moment of a genuine choice, multiple futures are actually possible, and you, as an agent, can truly select between them in a way that is not fully fixed by prior events. If that is true, the universe is not a single rigid chain of causes, but a branching tree of possibilities. However, libertarian free will faces its own puzzles. If your choice is not determined at all by prior causes, then what makes it your choice instead of a random event? If nothing about your character, your reasons, or your situation explains why you chose instead of B, then in what sense is that you making the choice? Trying to escape determinism, we seem to fall into randomness, and neither extreme feels satisfying. A fully determined you seems like a prisoner. A completely undetermined you feels more like a dice roll than a person. This is where a third camp enters the picture: compatibilism. Compatibilist philosophers argue that determinism and free will are not enemies. For them, freedom does not mean no causes. It means acting in accordance with your own motives, values, and character without being forced or coerced by something external. In this view, even if your desires have causes, your decision can still count as free as long as it flows from who you are and what you care about. Imagine you love chocolate, and at the store you choose a chocolate bar. A strict determinist would say, your past experiences, genetics, mood, marketing influences, and brain states all pushed you toward that bar. A compatibilist would say, yes, and that's fine. The important thing is that no one held a gun to your head. You weren't hypnotized or manipulated against your will. You acted according to your own preferences. That is enough to call the choice free in the sense that matters for responsibility and everyday life. Notice that most of our social systems implicitly follow this compatibilist logic. Law, morality, praise, and blame all assume that what matters is not whether you are caused, but whether you are controlled. If someone acts under extreme threat, we see them as less responsible. If someone's mind is seriously impaired, we may treat them differently under the law. But when a person acts out of their usual character and intentions, we hold them accountable, even if we know that their character and intentions were shaped by their past. Still, not everyone is satisfied with compatibilism. Some feel that it is just changing the subject, redefining freedom in a weaker way so that it can survive in a deterministic world. They long for a deeper, more metaphysical kind of freedom, the power to break completely free of the chain of causes. Others reply that even if such absolute freedom does not exist, the kind of freedom compatibilism defends is the kind that actually matters in the lives we live. The difference between acting like a puppet and acting as a person. At this point, it might be helpful to move away from grand metaphysical claims and come back to something more practical, the sense of responsibility. Almost all of our emotional life relies on the idea that people can, at least sometimes, do otherwise. When you feel angry because someone hurt you, part of that anger comes from the belief they didn't have to do that. When you feel guilty about something you did, part of that guilt comes from the thought, I could have acted differently. If we fully abandon these ideas, our concepts of justice, apology, forgiveness, and personal growth would start to crumble. There's also a psychological risk in some versions of the no free will message. If someone comes to believe that nothing they do matters because it was all determined anyway, they may feel empty, passive, or hopeless. Research suggests that when people strongly internalize a belief that they have zero control, they can become less motivated, more likely to give up, and sometimes more likely to act irresponsibly. A sense of agency, even if imperfect and limited, is deeply tied to mental health. So maybe we should think of free will not as an unlimited power, but as a limited yet real space of influence. Imagine your life as a maze. You did not design the maze. Its walls are built from your genetics, your family, your culture, your economic situation, your traumas, and your luck. Those things are real and they matter, but inside that maze, you still move. The turns you take, the rooms you enter, the people you choose to trust or avoid, these paths form something that is recognizably your life. You might not be able to walk through walls, But you are not a passive stone either. You are a walker in the maze. Think for a moment about a decision in your past that you are proud of. It might be a time you apologized when your ego wanted to stay silent, a time you took a risk that opened a new chapter, a moment when you helped someone even though nobody was watching. In those moments, you likely felt something like, I chose this, I stepped up. No scientific experiment can fully capture that inner experience. Maybe it was shaped by countless prior causes. Maybe if the universe were rewound, you would do the same thing again. But from the inside, it still feels like a meaningful expression of who you are. Now think about a decision you regret, a word you wish you hadn't said, a habit you wish you hadn't repeated. Sometimes people use the idea that everything is determined to soften the sharp edge of regret. Maybe I really couldn't have done better at that time, they say. That thought can be kind up to a point. It reminds us that we are influenced by many forces and that self-forgiveness is important. But if we lean on it too heavily, we might lose our motivation to grow. It might be healthier to say, given who I was back then and what I knew, perhaps I couldn't have done much better. But now I see more clearly, and the next step is mine. And perhaps this is where a more grounded sense of free will lives, not in cosmic debates, but in the small gap between yesterday and tomorrow. You may not control the raw materials of your mind, but you can work with them. You can notice your patterns. You can question automatic reactions. You can pause for a breath before you speak. Those tiny shifts are not magic, but they are real. Over time, they can change the shape of your path through the maze. In the end, the question, do we really have free will, does not have a single, simple answer that everyone agrees on. Some say no, some say yes, and some say yes, but not in the way you first imagined. What this question can do, however, is wake us up. It can make us more aware of the forces shaping us, our biology, our history, our environment, and also more aware of the moments where we can lean gently in one direction instead of another. Right now, as you hear this sentence, you are again at a tiny crossroads. When this video ends, what will you do next? Maybe you will open another tab and distract yourself. Maybe you will sit for a few seconds in silence. Maybe you will send a message you have been postponing or start something you have been avoiding. None of these choices will be made in total freedom, and none of them will be made in total slavery either. They will be shaped by who you have been, and they will help shape who you are becoming. Thank you for walking through this question with me. Whether or not free will exists in a perfect philosophical sense, the fact that you have spent this time reflecting on your own mind already says something important about you. And whatever you choose to do after this, however constrained, however influenced, it will still be your next step.